This one's for Mr. Jones. There's obviously climate change is a really political issue, but how do you see your work, the art that you've created with this exhibit, affecting decisions that will be made and how people look at their attitude toward the environment and wildlife?
It goes unstated, but my work has an environmental bent to it. So if I have any influence on people, it's hopefully to awaken them and inspire them to what we have and that they excuse me, currently don't know about. But if they don't respond positively, I can maybe at least engage them in a discussion. And that is what's really important. Like I said in my presentation, that 90% of this place is unknown to people. And, well, what does it mean then to them? What do they think about it? Well, there's 9/10 more of this to go, and well, gosh, it's very diverse. There isn't porcupine caribou herd isn't birthing in these other locations, but is it significant to them? That's a very good question. So that's how I see my work, is to hopefully, my hope is that they're inspired, but let's open up a discussion.
Yeah, and just to build on that a little bit, on .earth, which you would think is mainly about science and stuff, it's very much about art and about communication as well. This image here was made by a science illustrator in England named Adam Nieman, who is trying to figure out new ways to look at old things. And here he took the volume of the world's oceans. If you took all the water out of the oceans, the oceans are 2 miles deep, 2.5 miles deep in the middle, and you put it in the form of a sphere. How big would that be compared to the Earth? It's that little green bubble. That's all the liquid water on the planet. So when I talk about water issues, I like to start with that image. And it's not a confrontational image. It's not a worry me image. It's just a quantitative, it's a new way to think about quantity. And it says to me, if you're worried about bluefin tuna or any of the global issues related to the future of oceans, you start with this picture. And it doesn't have values. It's just a conversation starter. This here, this pinkish bubble is all the world's atmosphere. If you unwrap the atmosphere from around the planet, you put it in the spherical volume at sea level pressure. Remember, air way up at airplane height is thinner. That's the volume of the entire atmosphere that we all, heading toward 9 billion people, have to figure out how to share. So again, it doesn't say, oh, woe is me. It just says, here, let's start with this. The reality that we do live on a finite planet, and these are the quantities we're talking about. And so there's ways to play with it. That's why this is, again, as you heard over and over again, this is not an issue just for scientists, just for engineers, just it's for everybody. An artist can play a meaningful role. One website I would love you to go to, if you can, is visualizing.org. It's a bunch of people playing with new ways to look at data. And it's really, really interesting.
And I just want to add in that in the Bruce Museum, this is a museum of art and science. And a lot of times we like to put those in two separate categories. We have our artsy crowd over there, and here's our scientists, our math and science people, and we shouldn't do that. It's everybody. And when you think about some of our great people, Leonardo da Vinci, was an artist or a scientist? Or we have a wonderful scientist who wrote a book, Rachel Carson. So as a journalist, was she really that great of a scientist, or was she such a great writer that she brought the whole idea of pollution and contaminating the earth in her Silent Spring and getting people to understand pollution problems through her journalistic style and message. So really think about how important that is, that relationship, art and science. Like I said, the Bruce Museum here, it's a reason that we have this great institution, and we should not always be separating them out.
Bravo.
I was curious to know if somebody had a question for Sara James by any chance. I feel like we're forgetting about her. Shouldn't.
Well, first of all, it's to the panel, but Sara, you feel free to jump in on this one. I'd like to thank all of you for being here, because it certainly adds legitimacy to the entire program when a panel of your type is willing to give up its time to be here. And I thank you for doing that. I guess my question is, filters. We hear from the news all the time, and we read about Anwar, and we hear about Anwar, but Jeff, you've obviously been looking at it through a different lens, as have you, Sara, because you're from there. And Fran, you spent many, many years there. In terms of biodiversity, what changes are most pronounced? The loss of biodiversity. What changes have you actually seen? We read things, how true is it? We hear things, is it true? Is it legitimate? You've all been there. You've seen changes over years through your lens, through your photography. Sara, you live there day in, day out. What's the number one canary in the coal mine? What's the harbinger here that we need to be aware of, other than CO2?
Great question, Mr. Collin.
Yes, CS2 is a scary one. What's scary for me is that in Alaska, like I was earlier saying, we got nothing but Sarah Palin there. And they're scary. And yeah, and they have the money, we don't. That's scary. So those are the scary things for me.
I'll just say the total time I've spent in the refuge is about 4 months, and that, that's a second compared to the lifetime Sara's had there and the 20-plus years Fran spent in the refuge. The changes that I've seen in the refuge is coastal erosion, particularly since 2005, and I don't see any. You used to see on the coastal plain these ice lenses, the permafrost pushing up, and just boom, you'd just be walking along. Whoa! All of a sudden, here's this. It's the permafrost has broken the surface, and you get. I don't see those anymore.
I want to just show you guys. This is one of those issues that's a slow drip issue. On .earth, there's this whole category of things called slow drips. Hard knocks are things like the earthquake that just happened. Slow drips are sequential things that are basically invisible on even on a year-to-year basis. So this was the North Slope of Alaska in 1968. And look at that way up there to just get your location. This does not include Anwar. Anwar is, the reserve is over here just to the right. So this is all the state land and then other federal land there that was exploitable. And when oil was discovered in Prudhoe Bay, it was like, oh ho, so click the first one. See these, this is pipelines. The Alaska pipeline, next. 1989, and one more. 1999. So, and that all happened invisibly. America wasn't writing, no newspaper was writing headline each year, now, there's 10 more oil wells, 10 more oil wells. But essentially the central part of the North Slope, remember that this is America's only Arctic patrimony, this area up in the northern part of Alaska over through the Bering Strait. So we're industrializing that part of the world. And it doesn't look like this. When you fly over it, it's still very sparse, but it's changed in profound in ways that can't be undone for a long time, because pipelines can't be buried, for one thing, because of the permafrost and other issues. So they have to be on the surface. So the question is, do you want that to extend over this way? Now, there was going to be some more drilling here that got stopped for economic reasons. And do we want the coastal part of Anwar to start to look a little bit like that? So it's a values question. Can there be one part of America's Arctic patrimony that is left not like that? It's part of what we're talking about, I think.
That's an excellent illustration. The oil industry often uses a word figure when they talk about their small footprint that would exist in an oil development scenario in the Arctic Refuge. And they condense it down to no more than 2,000 feet, which would be like a a postage stamp at Dulles Airport. But the rest of the story is exactly what Andrew showed here, is that there's a sprawl, and that the footprints that the industry makes are largely occupied footprints. When you're out in nature and you see where an animal has stepped in the mud, that's where the animal had been. But in the case of the oil industry up on the North Slope, at least for the foreseeable future, these footprints are occupied. And emanating from that footprint are all kinds of disturbing stimuli to sensitive wildlife, such as sight, smell, sound, visual disturbances. At the time that caribou calves are being born, the females are highly sensitive to movement that they see on the horizon. It's an anti-predator strategy that they've evolved over a long period of time, because when they first give birth to the young calf, the calf for the first few days cannot run very fast. So when the female caribou sees the movement on the horizon, it's to her advantage to start moving right away with this little calf that struggles behind her to get out of harm's way. So when humans come into this landscape and start building roads and driving trucks and people moving around, the caribou at calving time are displaced from a broad area, much bigger than the footprint that the oil industry actually operates out of. One other thing I'd add to this illustration is that I don't know if you've ever seen the image of Earth at night where all the city lights show up. Yeah. The North Slope of Alaska shows up like a big long city because of the lights associated with all this infrastructure up there.
Okay, we'd just like to conclude the Q&A section. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks everyone for the panelists for answering the questions very well. And thank you, and have a good day.